Um, if you've got a Bible, go ahead and take it. Go to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. We might have put the wrong text on the bulletin. If we did, I apologize for that. The preacher, we think most likely Solomon, is writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and he pens these words. But I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this was also vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched in my heart to find out how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, how to lay hold on folly, until I might see what is good for the children of men to do under heaven with the few days of their life. I made me great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. Then I made myself gardens and parks. I planted in them all kinds of fruit and trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female servants, and I had slaves who were born into my house. And I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I had gathered for myself silver and gold and treasure and kings and provinces. And I got myself singers, both men and women, had many concubines, the delight of the sons of men. So I became great and surpassed all those who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I didn't keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was the reward for my toil. Then I considered all my hands had done, and the toil that I had expended after doing it, and behold, all was vanity, or havel. In striving after the wind, there was nothing to be gained under the sun. This is the word of the Lord. Let's pray and we'll get started. Lord, thank you so much for this day. Thank you so much for allowing us to come together. Thank you so much for the fact that you love us and you save us. Thank you so much for the fact, God, that we have our future in you and our satisfaction in you. I pray right now that you bless our time together. Thanks, and I love you. In your name I pray. Amen. You may be seated. We're going to start. I'm going to ask you all this. Have you guys ever heard of the 3 Chinese curses? I know, right? We went from like a wonderful song to a downer text to Chinese curses. There's 3 of them. Jude, do you know them? Yeah. Really? What are they? I think we're thinking of different things. All right, okay, all right. I'm going to say it, and then you tell me, okay? So there's 3, and there's one of them. We've heard this a lot. May you live in interesting times, right? Another one is, may you be recognized by people in high places. And the third one is, may you find what you're looking for, right? So at first you hear them, you're like, how are those curses? It'd be great to live in interesting times. It'd be great to be known. It'd be great to find what we're looking for. The point of the Chinese curses, right, and the reason they're called Chinese curses is because they originated in China. Yeah, absolutely, right? Because they sound good, but I mean, to live in interesting times as we're living isn't as interesting as we thought. It's more anxiety-producing than interesting, right? The idea of having important people know who you are sounds good until you cross them, right? And the third thing, may you find exactly what you're looking for. The implied statement there is once you find what you're looking for, we find what Bono knows. It's not exactly what we're looking for after all, right? Our sermon title today is called Pursuing Passing Pleasures, because what the preacher looks at in this text is he found everything he's looking for. And like the Chinese proverb says, it's more of a curse than a blessing. I struggled a lot with the main idea of the sermon today. Here's what it is. I don't even think we got a tour, guys. It's simply this. We need to treat earth's pleasures for what they are, or we need to treat pleasure for what it is, okay? And what we mean by that is there's kind of 2 schools of thought, and we're going to look at both of them, though one of them is explicitly stated in the text, and one of them is, well, the idea is we have short days, so we need to do everything we can to feel good, right? And that's not the case. The other ditch you can fall into as a Christian is, well, earth's pleasures are fleeting, therefore they're bad, therefore we shouldn't be searching for pleasures. That's not quite the truth either. What we're going to see in this text is the place that pleasure has in our lives, and how, while it doesn't bring fulfillment, being fulfilled in Christ does ultimately lead to them. We're going to see 4 things in our text today. We're going to be seeing the assessment of pleasure. We're going to be seeing the work of pleasure. We're going to be seeing the reward of pleasure, and then finally the legacy of pleasure. So we're going to be seeing the assessment, the work, the reward, and the legacy of pleasure. Then after that, we'll go ahead and take the Lord's Supper together. So let's go ahead and get in. First, the assessment of pleasure. So we're going through the book of Ecclesiastes, and last week started what's going to be for us this 4-week chunk of Ecclesiastes, where the preacher, the author of Ecclesiastes, most likely Solomon, he's looking at these themes of wisdom and folly, right? And how you can be as wise as you want to be, and it's still vanity, it's still havel. We'll get into that next week. And then he gets into the other thing. He goes, listen, you can be as unwise as you want to be. You can live as foolishly as you want to be. That's not going to bring anything either. Ultimately, that's havel as well, right? So we started with kind of this big idea of being wise or foolish. It's vanity, or it's havel. That word havel means short-lived. Think of exhaling when you're doing the snow. Right? When you're shoveling, right? It's there for a second, and then it's gone, right? And wisdom, it's there for a second, and it's gone. Foolishness, it's there for a second, and then it's gone. He gets in here, and we're kind of in this idea of pleasure, and he says this. It's kind of the opening. He states the entire text in about a verse and a half, and then he lets the text breathe. He goes, listen, I said in my heart, come now, I'm going to test you with pleasure, right? Let's talk about testing. Let's talk about pleasure, right? So testing here is kind of like what the Lord does. It's making sure something holds water. You guys ever been like fixing a car, right? And you test it before you take it out on the road to make sure that whatever you did works? I remember the first time I changed my own oil. I didn't do that. So I dumped all the oil out, and then I put the oil filter back on, and I poured the oil in, and then I started it, and then I just drove out, and I didn't test the car, and what happened was I had a line of oil that went about a quarter mile to my job and back because I forgot to put in the oil seal, right? And I had like a lake of oil underneath me, underneath the car, and I went through like 3 bags of kitty litter trying to fix it. What happened was I didn't test it, right? Solomon here, or the preacher here, goes, okay, I know pleasure's a big thing. I'm going to test it to see if it holds water. I'm going to test it to make sure it works. Now, let's talk about pleasure. Depending on how old you are and what your media intake is, pleasure can have several different connotations. I actually spoke with our secretary this week to make sure the word pleasure isn't inherently sensual when we talk about it, right? And while it covers sensuality, that's not what it means. When the preacher's talking about pleasure, and when we think about pleasure today, the idea is it's something that brings joy and happiness and satisfaction. Okay? You guys ever have a really good dinner and you're like, oh, that was a good dinner. I feel full. That is something that is pleasurable, right? You guys ever, this is a thing that I do periodically, you guys ever play video games and it's just like a good session, whether it's 5 minutes on your phone or a couple hours after the kids go to bed, right? You know, you go, you play your game, and it was just like a good thing, and like you had a good time, and it was enjoyable, and nobody was on voice chat, so like you weren't getting yelled at all the time, and you're like, oh, that was a really good video game session. You know what that was? That was pleasure. You guys ever like get handed a project at work, right? And it's challenging, and you got to pull things together, and you learned new resources to do your task, and maybe you had a coworker that you didn't like, that you like more, or you just like less because of the shared experience of coming through and putting this project together. And you get done, and the report's out the door, or the thing's finished, or you pick up the new client, and you go, oh man, that was really fulfilling. You know what that was? That's pleasure, right? And what happens is, a lot of times in the world today, and this has been the case since creation, we try and find our ultimate satisfaction in pleasure. It could be any of those things, right? And what happens is the preacher does this, he tries to figure it out, he tries to build out pleasure, right? And he says, oh man, ultimately, that feeling of satisfaction, joy, or happiness after the good meal, video game session, project, entailment of married life, all those things, it's short-lived, right? Now, let me talk about how pleasure has kind of worked its way through in our culture and what we've seen over the past couple of years. And then we'll talk about why it's short-lived. When we think about pleasure, a lot of times a good word that comes to mind is like hedonism, right? Anybody ever hear that phrase? It's the philosophical phrase. It came out by this guy called Epicurean, which we'll get to in a minute, where it's the ultimate good is feeling good, right? That's not inherently like drinking or eating or our base desires. It's just, hey, the best thing you can do morally for yourself is to feel good. There's a phrase, it's quoted in the Bible. This is the foundation of Epicureanism, which leads to hedonism. Let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we what? We die, right? We're temporary, we're specks of dust. What is, God willing, hopefully between 70 and 80 years in light of 1,000, we're just candles in the wind. Let's enjoy it as we have, right? You only get one go around, right? And that's been around forever. In fact, now what we have sort of a similar version of that, but what it comes out as is this phrase expressive individualism. The idea now in popular culture is, what you are is you need to figure out what's inside of you and you need to express that, right? So, have you guys ever heard the phrase, you do you? Right? Yeah, I think that was like a Diet Coke phrase for a while, right? Or that Queen song, I want it all, I want it all, I want it all, and I want it now, right? And the idea is, that's underneath that is you're going to find satisfaction, you're going to find happiness in working through to find what's in you and then pushing that out, and you'll find pleasure at that, and that's going to make you full. We see that a lot, and it's both in conservative life and liberal life. It just comes out in different ways. And what happens is the preacher comes in, he says, behold, this is vanity. Now, that vanity, that word, it means, right? I'm full from a good pizza dinner for about 3 minutes. No, for if I'm being responsible, for about a day. I'm going to be hungry again, right? I'm hoping to get on and play video games this afternoon again if our kids get down, even though I was very satisfied with my video game time on Friday night, right? We've had really cool projects that we've done at church. Y'all, we're going to be doing more. It just lasts a minute. Now, what happens is, and we talked about this at the beginning, when we use that word havel or vanity, the preacher, the author, he kind of builds it out to mean more than just short-lived, and we're going to see it here because he goes on and he says, listen, I've said of laughter, it's mad, and of pleasure, what we're talking about, what is it? That word mad means insanity. You guys ever hear that phrase, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting a different result? That's what he means by that. The idea there is that, all right, well, that was pretty good dinner. That was a pretty good relationship. But the next one, that's what's going to bring it the best, right? It's always the next thing. It's always the next video game. It's always the next project. It's always the next session. It's always the next whatever. And what happens is the preacher, he goes through this whole thing and he's like, I love it. It says, I've said of pleasure, what is it? What he means is, a better way to ask is that it? You guys ever been really hyped? This happens to me a lot for movies. You ever been hyped for a movie? You watch the trailers. You see the trailer breakdown, right? You see the interviews with the directors and all that. And then you go and you watch the movie and 120 minutes goes by and you're like, what? That's it? There's people I won't accept movie recommendations from anymore because I've had too many that's it moments, right? And what the preacher does here is he goes, listen, all that pleasure, when we're striving for pleasure, what does it leave us with? Well, that's it. Here's a really good example of that. If you have 90 minutes to spare and you like documentaries, I want to encourage you to watch this documentary called Comedian. It came out in 2000 to 2002, and it follows the rise of two comedians. One is this guy called Jerry Seinfeld. Who here knows who Jerry Seinfeld is? Right? That was terrible. Oh gosh. Edit that out, please, right? Yeah, Seinfeld, one of the most successful sitcom in American history, in American television history. And, it didn't get canceled. He walked away because he was having a that's it kind of thing. What else are we going to do with the show? So he makes a very controversial last episode, right? If you've seen it, you're like, I understand why it's controversial and leaves. The documentary comedian shows Jerry Seinfeld coming back to comedy after Seinfeld. It was after Seinfeld, but like before his stand-up comedy and comedians and cars getting coffees and his interviews and the podcasts that he's been on, right? And it shows him starting up from the bottom again. And you get to see him like in the Comedy Cellar in New York, like trying to have a joke and seeing it fall apart. And you see him getting heckled. It's really interesting. The other comedian it follows was this guy, this up-and-coming comedian called Orny Adams, right? O-R-N-Y space Adams, right? And what happens is Seinfeld liked him a lot. And a big part of the movie is Seinfeld showing Adams how to be successful in comedy. And about 80% of the way through the movie, Adams, he's doing his best to be this New York comic. And there's this scene where he gets a call from Jay Leno, before we didn't like Jay Leno, asking him to do a spot on the Late Night Show or the Tonight Show, right? And if you're a comedian, getting that spot means you've made it. Before YouTube, if you got a spot on one of those, like Carson way back in the day, or Letterman, or even Colbert before Colbert was Colbert, right? It meant that you could tour forever. Your future's guaranteed. And you see this whole camera thing where he gets the call and he starts crying, and it follows him up out of the Comedy Cellar, and he gets on the phone and his voice is shaking, and he calls his mom, and you can hear his mom excited for him, like this guy made it, right? And he hangs up and he puts his hands on his waist and he looks around and he dries the tears, and then his face just goes blank and he sits down on the curb, and then he lays down. And then he sits up and he looks at the camera. He goes, everything I've been working for bought me about 4 minutes of happiness, and that's it. Right? Now, he's still a comedian, right? He's got a podcast. His stuff is stuff that I'm not going to recommend, right? You can find it online. You can make the argument that he's a funny guy. But here's the point. His happiness, his pleasure was just for a couple of minutes. What's funny is that song, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, it was written by the Rolling Stones trying to find satisfaction. They're still touring. That song, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, same theme, they're still touring. These pleasures that we seek, that this is going to be the one, you know what it ends with? More often than not, I would say every time, if it's your ultimate, is that it? So we continue on, and we see this idea that it is temporary, but then we got to start talking about what is pleasure, right? We define it at the beginning, but if you come out of Baptist background, a lot of times when you think, you think pleasure, it's the sex, the drugs, and rock and roll, right? The things that the preachers preach against, right? D&D in the 80s, right? But what happens is he goes on and he lists all of these things that you can pull pleasure out of, and I love that he does this, and what I want to do here, and this is going to be challenging and angering for our people, but that's okay because it's Bible, okay? I know. What happens is he goes and he lists all these pleasures he pursues, and what is insane is you can find them being spoken well of elsewhere in the Scriptures. All the 4 things we're about to look at, okay? And we're building to this point that he makes at the very end, okay? But what do you do to get pleasure? Is it just doing the drugs? No, it's not. We see these 4 things, right? He goes on and he goes, listen, verse 3, I searched out in my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, how to lay hold on follow until I might see the good of the children of man to do under heaven in the few days of his life. So what happens is his starting place is the bar or the pub, which is short for public square, by the way, right? What happens is, the preacher is like, well, the first thing, I've seen a lot of guys find joy in alcohol, so I'm going to find wine, right? And you're like, yep, absolutely. You drink wine, everyone's going to die, it's the worst. But what happens is when you look in the Bible, there's these 2 verses, and I'm going to read them to you now, and it talks about pulling joy out of alcohol. Man, like this is going to be the hardest thing some of our people hear in the 3 weeks we've been in Ecclesiastes, but we're committed, right? There's this really interesting text. It's over in Proverbs 31, and King Lemuel's mother is writing it, and she speaks of wine to Lemuel. She goes, "Wine, it's not for kings, O Lemuel. It's not for kings to drink wine, nor rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed and pervert the rights of his afflicted." You're like, okay. And then she says, "Give strong drink to the one who's perishing, and wine to those who has bitter distress. Let them drink and forget about their poverty, and remember their misery no more." She's not being sarcastic, okay? You're like, well, that was the Old Testament, and that's Proverbs. Well, you go to the New Testament, and Paul, who writes a third of the New Testament, is writing to Timothy, who has stomach ulcers, and he says, "Drink no longer water, but a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments." A lot of commentators, a lot of scholars think that those frequent ailments that Timothy has is most likely anxiety and ulcers, right? And what we're seeing here, and the only point that I'm making here, and this is important, is that there is pleasure, there's joy, there's happiness that can be pulled out of having a glass of wine. Now, is having a glass of wine the same thing as like having a black garbage bag full of Natty Light? No, in case you're wondering, no, those are two totally different vibes, all right? Way different, right? But what happens is we see this thing that there's absolutely pleasure that comes from wine. And we move on, and he goes on, he says, "Listen, I've made great works." And he starts listing out these works. And we move from wine to the idea of work, satisfaction coming from work, right? And he goes, "Listen, I built houses, I planted vineyards for myself, right? I made myself gardens and parks, those are orchards, right? I planted with them all kinds of fruit trees, and I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees." So let's talk about this for a minute. So, a lot of us think, most people think that the preacher, the writer of this is Solomon. And what's really interesting is a lot of these things get attributed to Solomon, both in the Old Testament and by historians outside of the Old Testament. Solomon was very wealthy, and the reason he was wealthy is because the guy knew how to work. He starts talking about these gardens next to his home, and what he's doing there is it's two things. One, he's planting stuff so he doesn't have to go across the town to get stuff. But the other thing, a lot of times kings and royalty would plant gardens with exotic fruit and spices from across the world to kind of show that they've done deals. So the idea here is it's not just that he had okra and tomatoes, right? Although those are two good things to have, but he got okra because he traded with a place that had okra, and he made a deal, and on top of that, proof that he made a deal and made good business was that okra, right? And then, the vineyards, it's the same kind of thing. That's a steady income, right? Something we forget about a lot about wine in the Old Testament is that it's there not just as that, but also it was used to kill a lot of the germs in the water that it was mixed with, right? It's the same thing as oh man, I hate to drink it when I hike, but sometimes I have to. There's little pills that you put in your water to do what? Iodine. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Deb. Absolutely. Just like iodine in your water, right? So it goes on, and it's not just that. It's this idea of work. And what's crazy is sometimes we're like, man, well, work, it's a bad thing. It's a sign of the fall, right? No, work is a gift from God. You go to Genesis chapter 2, and what does God give Adam and Eve? He gives them work, not a job, but work, right? A job's a gift from God too. That's a different sermon though. And what happens is you go back to Proverbs, same guy writing it most likely, over at Proverbs chapter 4 or Proverbs chapter 10. And what does it say? A slack or a lazy hand, it causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent, it makes rich. He who gathers in the summer, he's a prudent son, but he who sleeps in harvest, he's a son who brings shame. What we see is there's this okay push to work and to save up, right? Whether it's short term, so agrarian culture, you put the rice or you put the grain back in the fall so you have food to eat in the winter, or 2026, putting back money so you have something to retire on. Y'all, Proverbs, Genesis 2 says that's a gift from God. That is a pleasure that is from the Lord, being able to work, being able to go in on the project, being able to lay down pipe if you're a pipe layer. I'm so white collar in my work. Oh my goodness. thirdly, he moves on and we see luxury, right? He goes on and he says, listen, I bought male and female servants, and those who were in my house had kids. Then I had great possessions of herds and flock, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. And I always, wait, let me make sure I got all this right. I might have skipped one, y'all. I'm so sorry. Yeah, there we go. The next thing. So we see these two things in luxury, right? First is this idea of people doing things for you, right? So what happens is the reason the preacher would have had to have get employees or servants is because there was too much for him to do, right? That's why we have it. The small business that gets big enough to need a secretary, right? The school district that has a big enough student population to warrant a couple more buses or a couple of teachers or a new school. You know what that is? That's luxury. Because he has servants, the preacher doesn't have to tend to his garden as much, right? Because he has servants, the preacher doesn't have to keep track of his books as tightly because he can find someone to do that. It's a luxury to have things. And, something I struggle with a lot coming up from not having a lot is I used to get on people for having luxury, like that being a symbol of not being a good person. I found this really interesting proverb in here. Let me see if I can find it, because the Bible it implies the goodness of luxury. It says, it's not fitting for a fool to live in luxury, much less a slave to rule over princes. And what the guy's talking about there is, luxury is wasted on a fool. I'll defend that a little bit. Like, you guys know that statistic? It's like 40% of people who win the lottery go bankrupt in like 3 years, right? It's not fitting for some people to have all that money because it'll get wasted. The point that the writer, probably Solomon, of Proverbs is saying is a fool shouldn't have luxury because A, he didn't earn it, and B, he's going to waste it. Right? There's a lot of really good things about our cell phones that bring luxury, but you shouldn't be living off. I don't want to name any apps because then I'd have to delete them, right? That's kind of what he's talking about, right? So first we see this luxury here, and then it goes down, and we see this idea of it's under luxury, but we see the arts and we see sex, right? Great week for Family Week. He goes on, he goes, listen, I got singers, both men and women, right? And like what we see here is like, for us, singers is as simple as like, getting Pandora on our phones or going old school and getting CDs or, getting Spotify or whatever. If you're going to listen to music on the regular, that was a huge luxury because he had to hire musicians, train musicians, get musical equipment, house all this stuff, and make sure that that musical equipment is upkept, right? What's crazy is that like the arts and culture, it's a gift from God. I've been going through the Bible, and I just got through Ecclesiastes last week, and there's this part where they're out and they're building the temple, and the author, most likely Moses of Exodus, talks about this person, this man whom God has gifted with art and artistic ability, and he does all these really beautiful, intricate things with tapestry on the temple. Art's this gift of God, right? You can see God, not literally, but through art, and these themes can draw you to the Lord. Next is the idea of, we'll say, physical intimacy. I'm not going to read any verses from this because I can't, because of the day of the week it is. But, physical intimacy is a good thing that God gave that gives pleasure and satisfaction. And we're in this really weird spot to where a lot of people grow up where it's this icky, sticky thing that you have to do to reproduce, oftentimes because of people from the pulpit calling it that, or maybe you've had terrible experiences growing up, but it's a good gift. On the other side, people think it's the be-all, end-all, and that's why we exist, and it's not that either. It's good, and it's a gift in that there's an entire 8-chapter book of the Bible dedicated to that, to show its goodness and its pleasure. And I can't read from any of it today because of how explicit it is. That's Song of Solomon, right? And the point is, when we look at this, what we see is the works of pleasure. It's stuff that you encounter by living your everyday life. Let me give a good example. I paid $3 for this illustration. I bribed my son to let me say it. So let me give a good. Oh, you know what? That's next text. We're going to save it. But what we see here is everyday life brings pleasure, right? You can't live and not have pleasure. It's close to impossible. All right? And you're like, well, how is it vanity? We're getting to it, right? We move on and we see, the assessment of pleasure. We see the work of pleasure. Next, we see the reward, right? This is the first positive thing that the preacher says in the book, right? He goes on, he goes, so it became great, and I surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. My wisdom remained with me. What that means is he drank, he didn't become a drunk, that kind of thing, right? He goes, and whatever my eyes desire, I didn't keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. Okay, so here's this really interesting thing about people. Our eyes, what we have here, are bigger than anything else in our body. And what I mean by that is our eyes will always have a bigger appetite than our heart or our wallet or our libido or our work ethic or anything. In fact, there's this text here. Let me see if I can find it. Proverbs 27:20. The death and the grave are never satisfied, neither are the eyes of man. What the preacher is saying here is anything I wanted, I chased like a dog after a car, right? And what does he say here? He goes, my heart found, here's the word, pleasure in all of my toil. And this was the reward for all my toil. So all the things that the preacher went after, what happened was he went after it, he kept going after it because it wasn't awful. It felt good, right? If you work hard and your boss gives you an attaboy and you feel good for that attaboy, you shouldn't feel bad for feeling that good. Does that make sense? Right? I think a lot of times in religiosity, anytime we have a good meal, we'll feel guilty because we were enjoying something that wasn't the best thing, right? Because it was a meal and not the Bible or something like that. No, that meal is a gift from God. That's what that is, right? To really double down on alcohol and physical intimacy, there's this Bible verse where it talks about his kisses and his lips are like fine wine, right? And, let's talk about this for a minute. The reason a lot of times people lean into pleasure is because pleasure is good and it feels good. Here's my example that I paid $3 for, right? Last year, you would be surprised to know this, but I like the outdoors. And I'm trying to bribe/make my children like the outdoors as well. So last summer, it was July, August, before the dog days. I was going for a hike, and I'm an overnighter, and I brought my oldest, right? And I said, hey, would you like to go hiking with me? And he said, no. And I said, okay, you're going hiking with me, right? And he was like, all right, great, it'll be fun. Mandatory fun with dad is the best kind of fun. Right, and what happens is we went, and I packed everything in my pack, and we got a sleeping bag and some stuff, and Jude had his, and it was a 3-mile hike. Now the thing about being 10 is 3 miles is like a pretty big distance. You take it for granted when you've hiked 3 miles a lot, right? To a runner, 3 miles isn't a lot. If you've never hiked 3 miles, that is a lot, right? It's even longer when your dad gets you lost and he makes it 5 miles. Which happened, all right? We got to the park at like 2 in the afternoon. Sundown was at 7, and we barely beat sundown, right? It was a dad doesn't need a map kind of day, right? Everybody who's laughing at me should, right? So what happens is it got so far where like we'd go, like we went, and then like, Jude would be like, hey, I need a break. I'd be like, great. We'd get up, and then I'd need a break and be like, great. And it got to the point to where like every 100 or 50 yards, man, Jude would just need to rest. Because he never walked that far. And it got worse because in the last stretch of our hike, we pulled out a water bottle and we dropped it and it shattered. So we were down to like 50% of our water, right? And Jude's like, we can't, like there's this moment where we both realized it's less work just to get the thing done than it is to go back to the car, right? And by the time we would have got back to the car, the park would have been closed and we couldn't leave anyways, right? So we're committed, right? And he's like, I'm thirsty. I'm like, I hear you. This is how much we have, right? It's like, okay. So we finally get to the campsite, and like it's backwoods. It's nice, but like their campsite was like packed gravel, which is uncomfortable, right? But I was like, all right, I'll tell you what. I'll set up the tent. I'll set up the dinner, right? We got to ration our water. And he goes, okay. And he goes, I'm really thirsty. I go, would you like an apple? He goes, yeah. So we lay out the sleeping bag on like the crushed gravel, and Jude lays on the sleeping bag, and he goes, that's the most comfortable thing in the world. And then he takes an apple and he takes a bite, and I hear him go, oh man, this is literally the best apple I've had in my life. Can I tell you something? It was, right? Do you know what that is? That's reward for toil. That's a gift from God, right? Going in and feeling the sweat in your eyes from working in your garden, and then going back in and showering off, and then looking out and seeing a tilled garden, that pleasure, that's a gift from God, right? Having a good romantic day with your spouse is a gift from God. It's a reward from doing what's good. And you're like, all right, Larry, so like 1/3 of your sermon, you've said how awful pleasure is. 2/3 of your sermon, you've said how good it is. How can it be both? That's the fourth point. Let's land the plane. So it goes on, and we see the legacy of pleasure. Last verse, verse 11. He goes, I considered all that my hands had done and all the toil I had expended doing it, right? And here's what he says. It's striving, and it's vanity and striving after the wind. We know that. Here's why. Because there is nothing to be gained under the sun. What does that word gain mean, right? Does it mean packing on a lot of muscle? I mean, sometimes, but like not exactly, right? What he's talking about is this, what you get to keep, right? You know, think of it this way, right? Part of the allure, and we're making an illustration here. Part of the allure of going to the blackjack table, if you're somebody who plays blackjack, is being able to take the chips that you win with you, right? You know, I'm up from the house, $500. That means I made $500. That means I gained $500. Imagine being up at the house but not being able to take the winnings with you. All right? That's what not having gain is. You know what's great is talking about, you know, the best apple ever. That was a year ago. I guarantee you that apple has been expended from Jude's energy, right? Jude's like, yeah, I could go for another one today. Lunch, Dad. Let's do it, right? Yeah. What happens is pleasure is temporary, and you can't take it with you, right? That's what the preacher is getting after. No matter how good of a meal, video game, work, romantic interlude, that doesn't come with you, right? There's this really interesting thing because like the guy who wrote Song of Solomon is Solomon, and the guy who probably wrote this is also Solomon. And if you read, and by the way, like if you get a chance, if you have like 40 minutes, read Song of Solomon, right? If you're married, read Song of Solomon with your spouse. It's very clear that Solomon, I'm going to use a kid word today, was a very thirsty person when he wrote that text. And absolutely he was, because it's a good and loving gift. And now at the end of his life, Solomon's like, I wrote that book, but man, I don't feel it. Why? Because there's no gain to be had. The reason seeking pleasure for pleasure's sake is vanity. Is that it? Is because you can't bring it with you. So what do we do with that? If all hedonism, if all self-expression brings is just desire for more self-expression, then what do? Well, elsewhere, there's this talk of pleasure, and it's in the book of Psalms, and the psalmist, I think it's David, I'm not sure, he's talking to the Lord, and he says this, you make known to me the path of life. Your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. See, where we get our ultimate pleasure from, our ultimate satisfaction from, isn't from a really good season in gardening, even though that's good. A really good glass of soda pop. There we go. Even though it's good. A really good meal. Even though it's good. No, we find it in the Lord. You see, there's this thing that the preacher's going to run into for the next 7 months, and it's the fact that he can't take his winnings with him. I'm up $500 at the blackjack table, but I have to leave it there, right? eventually all of us will close our eyes for the last day, and the property that we've owned will not be ours anymore. We can't take it with us either, right? Eventually our children will move out, and everything we've taught them, it's up to them to follow or not. We can't take that with us either. So what do? Well, Jesus has this really interesting thing. He says, we preached this about a month ago. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, right? What do you do instead? Jesus says, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. You see, the Christian life is really interesting because so much of it is storing up for when we get to be with Jesus. See, I can't take anything with me here. My legacy, whatever that is at this church, will be forgotten after I leave in between 2 minutes and a decade, right? My great-great-grandchildren will not know who I am. The good lunch I'm about to have in about an hour, I'm not going to remember in a year, right? I'm not, right? None of that comes with me. So how do you avoid poverty in the afterlife? Well, you invest in the afterlife. What's really interesting is Jesus, when he came here, he lived in perfect harmony with the Trinity. He had no reason to come out here, and he came down here, and when he died homeless. He died most likely nude. He was buried in a borrowed tomb. But what we see is that after the resurrection, at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow. Every tongue confess that Christ is Lord on earth, things visible and invisible, and above the earth and under the earth. The thing that stays with us is our relationship with our Creator, Jesus Christ. Well, that opens up a really good question. What do we do with pleasure? Great question. We'll conclude with these couple of things. I think God created pleasure, and I think he created pleasure for a couple of reasons. One is I think pleasure is a creation from God as a bridge from human existence to the divine. Let me explain, right? There's been plenty of people who've gone for a hike on the West Coast overlooking the ocean and seeing the sun set behind the Pacific Ocean, which brings pleasure and reverence and awe. And the invariable thought that comes out of that experience is there must be a creator. The psalmist says, your goodness leads me to creation. How often have we received something good only to be reminded of the creator? Right? Secondly, I think it demonstrates the goodness of God. Over in James chapter 1, James, Jesus' half-brother, says, every good gift comes down from above, from the Father of lights, with whom there is no shadow or variation due to turning. What's really interesting is I've been blessed to be married to my wife, and I, God willing, will continue to be blessed to be married to her for a long time. That's only a picture of God's goodness in the future. The relationship I have with all three of my kids, which currently is great, is only a picture of the relationship I have with God. The book of Song of Solomon, as thirsty as it is, and read it, it's a great book, right? It's only a picture of the euphoria that we'll be having with the Lord down the line. And you're like, how does that work? I have no idea. See, what happens is the pleasures we have are meant to get us to look down the line and to look up at the Creator. The gift is indicative of the goodness of the gift giver. So what do we do with pleasures? We glorify God in them, and we understand that if we do not have a specific pleasure, whether it's romantic or professional, right? Whether I can't drink because I'm a teetotaler and things will go off the rail, amen. We thank God for the pleasures he does give us and understand that with him, any pleasure, when pushed, becomes a perversion, and it leads to sin, and ultimately it doesn't satisfy. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this day. I realize this has been a challenging book. This is a challenging sermon because most things we do in fact derive pleasure from, Lord, and we miss you in leaning into that. I want to pray right now for us as Christians, God, that we seek you for ultimate goodness and ultimate pleasure. And when you give us good things, that we look to you and say, thank you, God. And Lord, when the good things we have either run out or don't come, that we look to you and say thank you as well. Pray right now for anybody here who's not a Christian, God. Lord, that treadmill of pleasure, that treadmill of hedonism, that treadmill of self-expression and you do you, it's just a treadmill. We can run as hard as we want. We're not going to get ahead. I pray right now that you help us see you so we can get